Today, we're jumping into a really provocative argument about what the author describes as a cultural civil war in modern India. It all comes from a piece called The Defeat of the Amateur Indian. And trust me, it's an essay that pulls no punches, so let's get right into it. So the piece we're looking at kicks off with this incredibly powerful statement, and it's really the core of the whole argument. The author is basically saying a huge power shift has happened in India, where a group that was once on the sidelines is now taking center stage, both financially and culturally.
So what's at the heart of this conflict? Well, the piece frames it as a story of two Indias. But this isn't your typical story of rich versus poor. Now, this is about a deep cultural battle between two different mindsets, where one group is, apparently, losing its grip on a nation it once thought it ran.
All right, so let's start by trying to understand the first character in this drama, the one the text says has been defeated, the so-called amateur Indian.
So who exactly is this amateur Indian? Well, according to the text, it's not just about being wealthy. It describes a very specific, well-off, English-speaking class that, despite all its education, is portrayed as being totally unskilled, an amateur, when it comes to navigating the real world of their own country.
This quote just perfectly skewers their worldview. The text argues that this class sees itself as global, right? But it's this very specific, kind of narrow, Western-focused idea of what global even means. It's a type of globalism that, ironically, makes them feel like strangers in their own, incredibly complex country.
And you know, this disconnection isn't just some high-level idea. The text argues it's super practical. It paints a picture of a class that's totally helpless in everyday situations that most other people handle just fine, like dealing with a corrupt official. They're basically portrayed as tourists in their own land. And this feeling of being out of control, it apparently spills over into public life. The author claims that the spaces they used to think of as theirs, fancy malls, nice restaurants, theaters, they just don't guarantee that same degree of refinement anymore. Their comfortable little world, as the argument goes, is shrinking fast.
So what's the root cause of all this? Where does this huge disconnect come from? Well, the text points a finger squarely at one thing in particular, the English language.
This slide just lays out the linguistic trap the author is talking about so perfectly. On one hand, you've got English. It's the language of intellect, of formal education. But in real life, in a casual conversation, it comes across as stiff, maybe even comically arrogant. But then, on the other hand, you have the mother tongue. That's the language of the insiders, of getting things done. And the result of this, at least in the author's eyes, is huge. By putting English on a pedestal, this class basically unplugged itself from the cultural heart of the nation, turning them into outsiders in the one place they're supposed to belong. And the final judgment here, wow, it is absolutely scathing. English, with all its global prestige, is framed as a cultural failure. It's this crazy paradox where the very language they mastered has, and these are the author's own provocative words, retarded them. I mean, that's a seriously controversial claim.
Okay, so while the amateur Indian is getting more and more isolated, another huge force is bubbling up. And according to this text, it's a force that would unite pretty much everyone else against them.
And that force was this new, really potent kind of patriotism. The whole argument here is that this nationalism was so strong, it actually bridged the gap between the rich and the poor, creating a totally new kind of unity that was all about emotion, not economics. And listen, this wasn't some slow, gradual shift. The text lays out this incredibly fast transformation. You go from a youth that's described as totally clueless about politics in the early 2000s to just a few years later, a country where patriotism is suddenly this shared bond across all classes. So what was driving all this? The argument boils down to a few things. A deep need to belong, a real pushback against the old kind of preachy intellectual types, and this is a pretty controversial claim, the idea that it was actually easy for the rich to get the poor on board with what the author calls a useless national emotion. The text brings up a really powerful real-world example to show how this all played out, the whole thing with the national anthem being played in movie theaters. It describes a scene where it became, and I quote, unsafe to remain seated, not because of a law, but because of this intense social pressure from everyone else in the room. So you've got the isolated amateur Indian on one side and this massive, unifying wave of patriotism on the other. According to the text, what happened next was pretty much a foregone conclusion. And this is the real kicker. In this new India being built by this patriotic wave, the skills that the amateur Indian valued so much, their perfect English, their Western outlook, they just weren't the currency of power anymore. They had become, in a word, irrelevant.
The text makes a really incredible claim here. It says the death of this class didn't leave a hole. It actually led to a unification of classes. The idea is that once you remove this disconnected elite, everyone else, from the newly rich all the way down to the poor, could suddenly find some common ground.
And this last quote, man, it just perfectly sums up the whole argument. The powerful sense of belonging that the new India feels, you can only really understand it when you see its opposite, the total alienation, the orphanhood of the amateur Indian who doesn't have a home anymore.
So, the piece we've just walked through tells this really dramatic story of a society completely flipping on its head. But it leaves us with a huge question, right? After one India falls and another one rises, what happens next? What kind of country actually emerges from all that? And you have to wonder, what's really lost and what's gained in that process?